Hello, this is Kevin Williamson. I'm a writer in residence at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and this is How the World Works, a podcast where we talk to people about work and their jobs and jobs they've had and the meaning of work in our lives beyond just getting paychecks and those sorts of things. Although paychecks are nice to have too, we never sneer at that part of it. I am from time to time reminded of how small a world I live in. Not that my guest is a small figure, but in my little world, Adam Bellow requires no introduction. In the wider world, he might. Adam is a well-known editor of books, particularly conservative books. You and I did a book together a long time ago, which made you no money, I'm afraid. Sorry about that, but I did my best.
Don't feel bad. Most of them fail.
Yeah, most of them fail. It's the whole. Well, we actually should talk about this at some point. The kind of portfolio model of book publishing, I think, might be of interest to some people. But the first question I wanted to ask you was about an issue sort of near and dear to my heart. And I've set this up this way before, but I think I don't think anyone will mind repeating too much. There's a story you probably know, somewhat exaggerated, that there was a riot after the first performance of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. And I am anti-riot in general, but I kind of want to live in a society where if you're gonna have a riot, that's what you have a riot over. That people care about music and high art to that extent. You were a participant in something unusual in American history, and that I don't think really has been repeated at the same scale since, which is a genuine literary controversy. Now, the French have one of these about every other year. In the United States, they come along very, very rarely. You were the editor of a now very famous book by our mutual friend Charles Murray called The Bell Curve. And The Bell Curve, is that 1994? Is that right?
4 or 5.
1994, 1995. I was in college. And it's a book about IQ. There's a chapter about IQ and race that was very controversial. And the only chapter that 90% of the people who picked up the book actually read, probably, and certainly the chapter that everyone was talking about. I think that might have been the last real literary controversy of its kind in the United States. There in the 90s, we were just getting ready to enter the kind of post-literacy era ushered in by the success of Netscape Navigator and the World Wide Web and all that stuff that happened in the middle of the 90s. And but people who weren't around then, I think, for that, might have a hard time imagining how important this book was to the American conversation for about a year and a half or something like that. I would think it was a constant headline. There were books written about the book and collections of responses to it and all that sort of thing. And you were right in the middle of it. What was that like?
Well, there's nothing like starting at the top with on a subject like this. I'll say in just preface. I was always drawn to books that I felt would cause controversy. The book that really sold me on publishing, going into publishing, was Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. Bloom had been my teacher. I had spent a year in graduate school at the University of Chicago in the Committee on Social Thought, where my father also taught, and I knew Bloom socially. And I spent a year studying, Plato, Machiavelli, Rousseau, and Nietzsche with him. And then he wrote this book, The Closing of the American Mind. And I read it before it was published, as did a number of his friends. And I thought it was very abstruse and philosophical. And there was some interesting stuff at the beginning where he insulted Mick Jagger and made some remarks about, the sort of low intellectual level of American college students. And I said to him, this is very interesting, Alan, but how do you expect people to react? And he laughed. He said, it'll be just like the trial of Socrates. I'll be accused of disrespecting the gods and corrupting the youth. And I just had to laugh. It was a little grandiose, but actually that's exactly what happened. And so the person who brought me into publishing was the man who signed up Alan Bloom's book. His name was Erwin Glickus. He was one of the, like most publishers, are background figures. Nobody knows who publishes a book, and that's the way we like it for the most part. But I've gotten more attention than many other publishers because of all the controversial books that I have published. I started my career with Dinesh D'Souza's Illiberal Education. I went on to publish David Brock's The Real Anita Hill, both books that generated massive national controversies by younger conservatives, because that was my brief. I was to publish the conservative authors. When it came to the bell curve, that's a book that I inherited from Irwin after he had a falling out with the management at Simon & Schuster, and he left. He went. Publishers move around quite a bit. I myself have been at 6 publishing companies in my career. So I was left with the bell curve, and I worked with Charles and Richard Herrnstein. One of the unfortunate things about that book, and it very much affected the reception of it, was that Dick Herrnstein died before the book was published. And Dick was the psychometrician. He was the Harvard University expert on all this. Charles is a kind of a polymath, very, very good at, he understands statistics and how to read, study regression analysis and all that stuff. But he wasn't really the Harvard prof. So Charles was kind of left. Charles was left alone to explain the book. I was left alone to defend the book. The two of us bonded in that period. We knew it would be controversial, and one of the things to be said about that book is that it adheres to the model that I discovered is what you have to utilize, which is if you're going to unleash the unstoppable force, the irresistible force, your book has to be the immovable object. That's why the bell curve is a 600-page or 800-page book with several hundred pages of footnotes, hundreds of charts and tables and graphs, because anybody who was going to argue with it had to do the work. They had to master all this material. It's a big, hard pill to swallow for the people who wanted to jump all over it. And that is what. But we certainly knew that it was going to be controversial, as you said, for the reason that the IQ debate was very triggering around race. One of the tactics that Charles adopted was to first deal with IQ in relation to white people. This was sort of a way of blunting the reaction to say, well, this is valid. We're going to demonstrate its validity as a matter of correlation. So IQ and intelligence, there's not a fixed relationship. You can't really prove anything. Certainly on the group level. And Charles, again, at the end of the book, makes a strong point, as you probably know, of his libertarian outlook and his commitment to treating people as individuals, not as members of groups. And the argument of the bell curve was meant to apply to groups and not to individuals. And so any individual can fall anywhere on the bell curve. The fact that you're born as a member of a particular social group doesn't condemn you to being relegated to a particular stratum of society. And that was the larger argument of the book, which got lost in all the argument, which is that we are living in a society that is increasingly, because of its meritocratic system, increasingly becoming stratified by IQ or the ability to kind of process and manipulate certain kinds of symbolic transactions and information. This is part of the reshaping of society along lines of measurable intelligence, which again, Charles would insist is nothing to do with your value as a human being. But it did set off in a massive, crap storm, and of course controversy sells. We had, as I recall, the cover of 5 national news magazines in the same week. That does not happen. I mean, when I had experience with Dinesh D'Souza and David Brock's books, which where you really felt you had really done something. You ring the bell in a kind of a way, and you sit there and you watch, you read the reviews, the attacks, the counter attacks. When you get down to when your inbox starts to fill up with letters to the editor written to small newspapers in the Midwest, you know that your book has really had an impact, that people are really thinking and talking about it and coming to grips with it. And, for a publisher of ideas and arguments, this is really, this is nirvana. This is what you're trying to accomplish. You want to have this kind of impact. And what are you trying to do? You're trying to get people to think. And how do you get people to think? You challenge their assumptions. This is what Alan Bloom did. This is what he demonstrated. When his book was published, it sold 1 million copies or more, and that's when that opened my eyes to what you could do with a book, what could happen with a book. Now, you raised the question properly of what happened to all of that. You're correct. I began to notice this myself because it was my trade, it's my stock in trade, shaking the tree, getting people to react, which led me to publish all kinds of stuff. Particularly I always had a proclivity for writers like you, people who are, sort of a little eccentric, and really people who, put things together in their own way, come up with their own synthesis, have original views. I always had a weakness for that kind of writer, and because I was trying to provoke people and get them to think. And the one thing that I would have to say is that people don't want to think. They don't want to. You have to force them. Thinking.
You mentioned being on the cover of 5 national news magazines and being written about in these Midwestern newspapers. That was a whole ecosystem that doesn't really exist anymore. Like, try to explain to someone who's 20 years old that Newsweek was a big deal once upon a time, and that being on the cover of Newsweek was a huge thing for a writer, or that being on the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch was a big deal, or the Atlanta Journal-Constitution or something like that. It's just a very, very different world. How much was that secondary ecosystem a part of what you did, and how is its absence and its decline affected what you do?
Well, it was indispensable. I mean, I entered a world when I came into publishing in around 1987. It was a print culture. The internet didn't exist, and there was a whole ecosystem of print publications that were fed from the top down. The New York Times, for example, Time and Newsweek, and certain Wall Street Journal, major brand publications with huge followings. They set the agenda. It used to be if you were the publisher of Random House and you had a novel or any kind of a book you wanted to get on the bestseller list, all you had to do was get it excerpted in the New Yorker. That was it. Boom. Or, we found as conservative publishers, because that's, Irwin was a conservative, I was a junior, partner in that. Irwin explained to me that publishing is a generational phenomenon. He said every editor finds and publishes the best writers of his own generation because they have an affinity, they understand, they care about the same things. And you rise with them. Their success is your success. And then 20 years down the road, you lose touch with what's coming up. You need to hire a younger person. Irwin was the publisher of George Will. George was at that time, a very important conservative columnist for the Washington Post. And if George wrote an op-ed about, your book, it became a bestseller. Again, this was a testimony to the way in which the print culture concentrated focus and attention. And there were these gatekeeping institutions, and they had large publics, and so through a very narrow aperture, you could reach a very wide audience, and people would buy the book. Fast forward, 20 years or more, and that's all gone, and it's clearly due to the rise of the digital media, to the internet, which, and this is a story we all know. The franchise of these marquee publications was hollowed out. They lost their hold on the audience. There was no more, it was a great sort of leveling or flattening of attention. It had its benefits. It brought voices into currency that would otherwise have been excluded. But it also undermined the culture's ability to sort or differentiate between the not say the legitimate or the illegitimate, but the reasonable and the unreasonable, so that the standards of judgment are, and we see this now, it's, public argument is dominated now by influencers, podcasters, people who are, sort of self-taught, autodidact types. Really, it's a kind of reversion, I think, to the 19th century in America, when it was much more of a free-range kind of situation. So there's a loss. I think there's a loss with that. But it's
So you
equivocal.
mentioned George Will being able to make a book a bestseller. When I was in New York, I was, among other things, the theater critic at the New Criterion. And I was the opposite of the New York Times in the sense that, maybe not me personally, but the New Criterion had enough of a reputation that a negative review could hurt your reputation, but a small enough circulation that a positive review didn't do you any good. It wasn't going to help you sell any tickets.
Right.
So there was nothing good I could do for anyone when I was in that role. Whereas the New York Times, even at that time, still, if they had a nice thing to say about your play, they could make your play a hit
Absolutely,
or kill it.
and yeah, and the culture writers at the New York Times are legendary for their ability to do that. Frank Rich, the theater critic, known as the Butcher of Broadway, could make or break a multi-million-dollar Broadway production, and that's the power of the platform. And it wasn't Frank himself; it was the New York Times that had that power.
Yeah. You wrote an essay I quite liked once. We'll transition back to work life a little bit here, called "In Praise of Nepotism." You mentioned being at the University of Chicago, where your father taught, and you also mentioned Alan Bloom, who, if I recall correctly, inspired a character in one of your father's novels, in Ravelsteen. So your last name is Bellow. Your father was Saul Bellow. You are a book editor. Your father, if I recall correctly, won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful, wonderful novelist. Henderson the Rain King, one of my favorite books. So your name must have come up a lot as an issue when you were first getting into the business. And I don't. Your father was not a sort of trenchant doctrinaire conservative like pugilist the way we sort of modern pundits are. But there aren't a lot of people who are kind of have that kind of conservative cultural valence in the literary world, which is something, of course, you've been fighting with your whole life, of trying to get people to write novels and to do creative work who are of that world. But anyway, so what was that like for you when you're first getting into, I'm going to do this thing in which my father and my name are going to have a huge shadow?
Well, like many people in publishing, at least in my generation, I stumbled into it. It wasn't my first thought. I wanted to be a writer, naturally, because I had a great model at home and somebody who was very, very inspiring and a truly serious person. Like that's what I would say. The writers of my father's generation, of his era, the Cold War era, were focused on big questions, high level, culture, history, civilization. When they got together, when his friends were people like Ralph Ellison and Gore Vidal and Philip Roth, and when they got together, they would talk about these things, and they would also tell, jokes and laugh. But, you would just listen to what they had to say, because you recognize that to be a writer or a man of letters in those days was a high vocation, and I decided at a certain point that I wasn't going to be able to cut it. That was not going to work out for me. I had been raised among books and writers. I was very conditioned to the literary world. I worked in bookstores, I wrote for magazines, I worked in newspapers, and tried all the kinds of print, all the forms of print media, because that was what I loved. And I had a lot of education. I went to a private school in New York. I went to Princeton University, where I studied the classics and medieval and Renaissance literature. I had Latin and Greek, French and Italian. I was very educated, much more than I needed to be. And it wasn't really suitable for me to go into any other profession. It turned out, it's just like I had been trained to do this without my knowing it. And so my
That's how I
wife,
got into journalism, lack of marketable skills.
yeah, lack of marketable skills, and that was my issue. And of course, around the time I was 29, I got married. My wife got pregnant on our honeymoon, using the Pearl Harbor method. Uh, and all of a sudden, I needed a serious job, and I naturally, so nepotistically, I went to see Irving Kristol, who was an old friend of my dad's from the University of Chicago, and Irving. Well, I didn't realize this, but Irving was the godfather of the neoconservative movement, and he recruited me into it, into the vast right-wing conspiracy, and I didn't realize what I was getting into. I just wanted to publish books and make a difference, and kind of move things, get people to think, and it was fun and exciting to do that. And I discovered very quickly that it was a true, what it meant to be a publisher was a true vocation. It's incredibly rewarding. And my initial phase in publishing was really as an academic editor. I covered a number of academic disciplines. I went to academic conferences, universities. I talked to people about their work, and I published a lot of books in a variety of fields. It was very interesting. Sort of, I have a kind of archaeology of public art, public debate in my mind that we go through phases. Like, for example, in those days, there was a lot of interest in civil society, or the roots of social order, how whether order and disorder can be generated. I published the book called Broken Windows, which was the basis for a certain kind of policing that was introduced. The idea that book called Disorder and Decline. If windows are broken in a neighborhood and nobody repairs them, things get worse. But if they are fixed, people see that, and it reverses the pattern of decline. And this has been very this is sort of part of my outlook. My going back to my father's politics. A lot of writers wear their politics on their sleeve. This has become a fashionable thing. This started in the '60s. Norman Mailer, people like that, were very William Styron. They're very much on the progressive side. My father was an older person, and he came out of the '30s really, and was very steeped in the sectarian Marxist debates of that era. And he moved to the right in a kind of classic fashion, from left to right, as a result of what he witnessed in this, happening in the Soviet Union, the show trials, the purges particularly of Jews from the cultural sphere, and he understood very clearly, as many writers did in those days, that there was a very clear distinction between the sphere of freedom and the sphere of tyranny. And although he didn't wish to be identified as a partisan in any way, he was fairly conservative, and I was influenced by him in that regard. If you want to read a really conservative book, it's his most obviously, self-evidently conservative book is Mr. Samler's Planet, which is it's a portrait of New York City in the '60s, as seen through the eyes of a Holocaust survivor, and he sees corruption, degradation, filth, lack of decency, loss of all kinds of civilized values. And I recently wrote an essay about that book, actually, for a little journal called Sapir, edited by Brett Stevens, and made the point that this was the very era in which I was growing up in New York City, and I thought it was really kind of fun and cool,
Yeah.
So we had a very different generational outlook. But
But
I've
the
kind of
politics on the
adopted.
sleeve thing is interesting because because I was a nerd, I was reading National Review and stuff like that from the time I was really quite young. But I probably read 1,400 pages of Tom Wolfe before it dawned on me that he was politically on the right.
Yes.
He just seemed like this fun, rollicking guy who had these interesting insights.
Yeah.
And part of me sort of thinks that conservatives would be better off if they were a little bit more like that in some ways, less consciously ideological and more about well, to repeat a phrase, how the world works. What reality is actually like. I'm going to shift gears for just 1 second here because it was from the very large, important issues of the Cold War to a much smaller and niggling issue, but I think it's something that people really care about, and I hear about from people from time to time for reasons that'll be clear to you here in a second. In your business and in mine, which are related and overlapping businesses, there's a good deal of socioeconomic homogeneity. And there's a good deal of religious and racial diversity and immigrants versus native-born people, but there are a lot of people from similar backgrounds who went to similar schools and that. And one of the reasons for that, I'm going to put on my pointy-headed left-winger Marxist hat here for a second, is that for the longest time, publishing and journalism were dominated by people who could afford to be poor when they were young. Because breaking into these businesses puts you in very, very low-paid jobs, often in places like New York or Washington,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to either be able to just weather that or have the kind of family who can sort of financially support you through those first couple of years of these, particularly in book publishing, where the initial jobs are just ludicrously low. I mean, even worse than journalism in a lot of ways. So I wanted to ask you a very specific question about that, which is, what do you think about unpaid internships? Every time an unpaid internship comes up in a discussion, I get some really interesting and often very heatedly negative feedback about the subject of unpaid internships. What do you think?
Well, I see that it's one of these questions that has two sides to it, and that, by the way, that's my proclivity. The difference between being a book editor and a magazine editor is that as a magazine editor, particularly a political magazine, you have to have a position on every issue. Book editors publish from all sides, and it's better if we don't have strong positions on particular issues, because my job is not to fight with my author, but to assist them in making their argument in the best way possible. Bearing in mind that I'm not just an intellectual publisher, I'm an entertainer. I have to sell a product,
Yeah.
and that's a big part of what we do. Now, your observation about the class issue in certain professions is very astute, I think, because it's quite true. What has happened is that there's a kind of a white collarization of these pursuits. Classically, journalism was a blue collar profession. My first job after graduating from Princeton was at the New York Daily News. I was a copy boy. It was very Runyon-esque because the guys who wrote and created the paper were the same as the Archie Bunker types who read the paper, all in Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island. And you were really among these people. They thought I was hilarious. My first day at work, I was Xeroxing clips, and I heard one of the editors say, "Which one's the Princeton kid? Point him out to me." They hazed me without mercy. For months, but then after that, I felt completely embraced by these guys and the culture, and it was very, very different over at the New York Times. Now, what has happened in the meantime is that all these like journalism, you have journalism schools that didn't used to exist. They are expensive. They're like finishing schools for liberal arts majors, and what has happened is now they've populated these major newspapers with, at this point, very ideological left-wing kids who think that journalism is a form of activism. This is a very upper-class elite perspective, whereas the Daily News, when I worked there, still had the reputation of being the tribune of the people. One of my jobs at the Daily News as a kid was to read the letters that were sent in by readers asking for help. My landlord is evicting me, things like that. And, it was, you could feel that the loyalty of readers to the paper was based on their sense that it spoke for them, that it was an organ of justice and rectitude. That's just gone. It's now just all careerism. That's all we have. And you can understand why, because the rewards are very attractive, because you do well at a place like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and you get a TV gig, you get a book contract. This is now it's all become kind of elite careerism. So now to get back to your question, well, what's the proper answer? I'm not really sure. I mean, on the one hand, if you want to overcome the nepotistic advantages that wealthy young people have, people raised with privilege, people who can afford who can afford to work for free, then you want unpaid internships so that worthy young people from lower economic strata. Well, actually, is that how it works? No, you'd want them to be paid, wouldn't you? Because how are they going to live in New York? In any case, this is now a legal matter. You can no longer give out an unpaid internship. They're required to be paid. I think
Is that everywhere?
probably
Did I miss this somehow?
it is a requirement, as far as I know, nationwide.
Oh,
There may be exceptions, but my understanding is, I mean, at least in our business, we're not allowed to take on an unpaid intern. They have to be paid. I think it's probably more egalitarian that way. That doesn't mean that there aren't still nepotistic forces at work in determining who gets these plum assignments. So you're going to be up against all kinds of barriers. If you're a working class kid, you're going to be up against all kinds of barriers. On the other hand, there's the whole culture of promotion of different minorities and marginalized groups, which is another form of nepotism, kind of a collective nepotism. So there's I think we have a healthy concern with who gets admitted into these professions and how. I would just say, in the current age, with all these professional schools, like even becoming a novelist, it's not like it was in the days of Thomas Wolfe, who just wrote a book and by hand and sent it in to his only copy to to the editor at Scribner. No, now he would go to an MFA program and he'd be part of a whole industrial machinery that is supposedly discovering and promoting new talent. What is the difference? I think the old system was better. I think you got more authentic American, more sort of class churning and more sense of what it's like to live at the bottom of the social scale. When my father was coming up, writers were self-made, and they all came from historically in the 19th century, most writers came from the upper classes. Because writing is a leisure activity. You have to want to be a poet. You have to have an income. But now it's with this professionalization, it's completely been inverted. So I think it would have been. I think it's better to have writers in this country who have lived at the lower level of society, who have had to struggle and support themselves, who know what it's like to be poor. And our culture today, our literary culture, reflects this bias. It's the books that are published today, the novels that are published today, are about the upper middle class, their divorces, their affairs, their addictions, their obsessions. It's very monocultural, and it's books written by people of a certain class for people of that class. And I think it's a bad development. I don't know if that answers your question.
no, it's a good discussion. You just made me think of something. You mentioned Thomas Wolfe, and there's just the way the culture has changed. It's funny. So we were talking earlier about that little ecosystem of newspapers and stuff. So it would not be uncharitable to say that my father was functionally illiterate. I mean, he could read, but not super well, and probably not well enough to get through like a New York Times op-ed or something like that. And my mother was a high school graduate, and she would read Louis L'Amour novels and things like that. But we still subscribed to two newspapers and Newsweek because it's just what people did at the time. But I was just thinking when you mentioned Thomas Wolfe, I'm a fan of the country singer Don Williams, who had a very popular song around maybe 1978 called "What Do You Do with Good Old Boys Like Me," which he references drifting off to sleep at night with Thomas Wolfe whispering in his head. I used to sing that song sometimes, and I would change it to Tom Wolfe because that's who I was reading more than a. I was more of an electric Kool-Aid acid test guy than a Look Homeward Angel guy. But although I like that book as well, that stuff has really just changed. What do you do all day? I ask people this question all the time. Like, what does a book editor do all day? I was a young newspaper editor in Philadelphia on the main line, there was a guy there I knew who had this just magnificent old house. It was one of these mainline mansions, and I didn't like it, but I wanted to be able to have one like that. Like I figured that was a good sense of options. So I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "You know what I do? I'm the president of XYZ Bank." I was like, "Yeah, but what do you do? Like, what do you do all day? What does your day look like? What does a book editor and publisher do?"
Well, of course, we do a lot of reading. I get every day. I get proposals and manuscripts, and I read. I
I interrupt you for just one second. So if I'm Thomas Wolfe sending in an unsolicited draft in longhand, now these days, how many people read that before it gets to your desk? Now there are some people I know who you'll have relationships with who'll send stuff straight to you, but
right.
the slush pile stuff goes through how many people before it gets to you, and how many of them are unpaid interns or formerly unpaid interns?
Well, there's a very complex feeder system that has grown up around the publishing industry, particularly the big companies. So, first of all, if you don't have an agent, your book will not get read. The slush pile is really not a path to publication. Partly because the stakes are so high, the investment that a big company makes in any individual book is so high in terms of its fixed costs that if you don't have a track record as a published author or a platform, as we saw, I never heard the term platform until I went to work for one of the big companies, Simon and Schuster. Because I had been signing up academics and I knew what their value was. They were experts in this or that. They had published previous books. I went to them. They didn't necessarily come to me. And then when I was at Simon & Schuster, I was sitting at a big table with all the editors and the marketing people and the sales people, and somebody had proposed a book, and one of those people said, "Well, what's his platform?" And I thought, aren't we his platform? We're Simon and Schuster. Doesn't it mean something? Doesn't that confer some, doesn't that mean that it's a good housekeeping seal and we have decided that you should read this book? No, that's not how it works. You don't, today you need to have social media, you need to have if not a position at a major publication or a TV or radio show, you need to have your own following. So these are the things that publishers look for. And the first sign that the first barrier you have to get through is the literary agent barrier. The agent is your go-between to the big publishers. The agent's job is a matchmaking job. The agent is responsible for knowing which editor at which house is going to fall in love with your book. That's what they're looking for, because your book needs an advocate. You're coming into a big house that publishes hundreds of titles a year. Even if getting a book deal is the least of it, the least of your worries. You have to make sure your book gets properly published and supported. That's the job of the editor. So you go back to your question. A lot of what I do, once I've signed a book, then the work begins. I have to get people excited about it. I have all kinds of colleagues, different departments, meetings, where and I'm constantly beating the drum. The enthusiasm starts with you. That's your job as an editor, and you see the book through all its stages of design and product, manufacturing, distribution, promotion. There's a lot of work that goes into publishing a book, and it's not just a 3-martini lunch. That people used to think is what editors do. Editors work very hard. And the people who have those jobs at the big houses are really, really talented, and I've been privileged to work with some of the best editors in the world, and I have a very high regard for their taste, their judgment, their skill, their knowledge of publishing history, what works and doesn't work, their ability to spot new talent. Editors are crucial. If they weren't, they would have been gotten rid of long ago. The management always wants to get rid of it. In every creative industry, there's a war between the creative side and the business side. The business side would like to get rid of the creatives, but they can't because that's who lays the golden eggs.
Yeah, they did that in newspapers, and they found out how that worked for them, which is not very
Yeah,
well.
yeah, they try it from time to time.
Yeah, there's I may have the numbers wrong on this, but I want to say I remember reading that when Pride and Prejudice came out, it was considered a great success because it sold out its first printing in some very short period of time, like a month. And its first printing was like 825 copies or something like that.
Yeah.
So if you're printing, what does it cost to bring out a typical hardcover book that you publish? I understand press runs will be different depending on the author. Mark Levin sells books by the truckload. Kevin Williamson sells books maybe by the box on a good month. And what does it actually cost to print a book?
Well, it is a question of scale. So the more copies you're printing, the less it costs. But you're making a major investment. So the cost of the physical cost is the least of it. The printing cost for a typical hardcover book of 300 pages is going to be it's going to run from $350 to $450 a copy, depending on various factors. That's a lot if you consider that the book is going to retail for $30 and Amazon takes half of the net. And then out of your remainder, you have to deduct your expenses and including the author royalties. So it's a low margin business, and most books, by far the majority of books that are published, and there are many, many books published, even by big houses, don't sell more than a couple thousand copies. Most books fail, and the big houses subsist on the hits, the big bestsellers, and they'll pay any amount of money, increasingly, for a book they think or are sure is going to be a hit. As for the non,
is there anybody who's really good at picking those stocks, or is
well,
that why you publish so many failures?
Editors have an average, like bookies, you're placing bets. And if you have a reputation for picking winners, you get the good books. They come to you, the agents send them to you. People write to you saying, I understand that this is why certain legendary editors in publishing, like late Alice Mayhew at Simon & Schuster, who was Bob Woodward's publisher, rule the roost. They are, and what they publish, because the publishing industry is still a 19th century industry in certain key respects, it doesn't operate like the pharmaceutical industry, or books aren't toothpaste. Each book is unique. It's not it has to be individually branded. And positioned and promoted. It's not like if you sell one tube of toothpaste, you can sell 1 million, and just buy shelf space. So Alice, when Alice brought a book to market, everybody all down the chain knew that this was an Alice Mayhew book, and that it was very likely it had her seal of approval. It had her imprimatur, and that applied to the literary press, people who review books, to the booksellers, to the distributors. Everybody understood because it's a system made up of human beings and human relationships, and that's what held it together for a long time. Now as for the cost, I can tell you this: when I was working at HarperCollins, 15 years ago or so. We had one of our periodic visits. The editorial group had a visit from the business manager, who came around to all the imprints and made a speech. And the speech went like this: we have run the numbers, and we have determined that it costs this company $150,000 to publish any book, irrespective of the advance that's paid. That's just what it costs us as a company. So what did we conclude from this, comrades? We conclude that we don't want you to sign up anything that isn't going to be a bestseller, because it's just going to lose money. And one of the editors said, "Well, what's wrong, with paying a modest advance and earning it back?" And the answer was, "We're not in business to break even. We're in business to make money. So, if you're not going to make money for us, publishing your line of women's novels or whatever, we'll fire you basically and hire somebody who publishes cookbooks, or some other thing that we're confident is going to make money for this company."
Do you
Because,
think there's a role for nonprofit book publishers?
oh, sure,
I
there
know they
are not.
exist.
Yeah, they do exist. The problem with nonprofit publishers is the problem with nonprofit anything, which is that it's insulated from the market and it doesn't really respond, or is not oriented towards demand. It's oriented towards the aesthetic preferences of the people running it. So it's kind of a scam, in my opinion, as a capitalist. I don't hold with it. I have friends who publish, people we know in common, who publish on a nonprofit basis. They have exquisite taste, excellent judgment, publish beautiful books. The books sell very small quantities, and they are, they're doing it for a certain, to play a role and achieve a certain level of satisfaction, which is important and valuable. If you can set that up for yourself, I applaud you, Don Corleone. I think that's great. But I'm in business to sell books. If my books don't sell, I don't make a living. And my job is to make sure, is to kind of harmonize or marry the quality and quantity. That's what we're trying to do. We have I have a commitment to being a serious editor and publisher. And I'm, anyone who's, worked with me can tell you, I'm pretty demanding, because I want the book to succeed. And in my experience, the more work I do on a book, the better it does, typically. But there's no guarantee. It's really a gamble in every case. So the upshot of all that is that the big houses. The problem with big publishing is that it's based on a model. The conglomerate model is supposed to create efficiencies and economies of scale. But what it actually does is it creates more costs, and that's true. That's the secret.
You mentioned having worked for 6 publishers, and I was thinking to myself, that's amazing because there are only 2. But there has been a lot of consolidation in that business, and they are,
Yeah,
much more.
it keeps going on, and it will continue. It's a game of musical chairs, and it will continue until there are only 2 big publishers. But what will happen, because the sphere of culture is like nature, it abhors a vacuum. So the more concentration there is, the more space opens up for small startups, and we're going to see much more of that. I think the independent publishing sector is actually very lively, and we're going to have, because what happens is that the concentration of resources at the top means that they say no to more and more books. They keep raising the bar for acquisitions. It used to be, you have to sell 5,000 copies, or then you have to sell 10,000 copies. Then it was 20. Now the big houses really won't buy a book that they don't believe is going to be a bestseller and sell 50,000 copies. So what does that mean? It means that independent publishers like myself have a tremendous amount of content to choose from. I'm inundated with stuff, very good stuff, that is just being turned down. Part of it is because they don't want to publish conservatives, or now Jews, because I also have a Jewish line. But a lot of it is that they just can't make enough money on it, and they say no for commercial reasons. And I think it's going to continue that way until the big houses ultimately collapse under their own weight, which I think is coming.
There would have been a time when saying Jewish writers have a hard time finding a publisher would sound like the silliest sentence in English. Given the outsized cultural footprint of Jewish writers in American history, it would have been news to a lot of very famous novelists of the 20th century. I wonder what your views are of electronic books. We sometimes, Jay Northinger likes to point this out, that in journalism, the daily part's built right into the name. Journo, you're an Italian speaker. Between what I do, which I expect to have a life expectancy of a really big piece, a really big reported piece, maybe 2 weeks,
Hmm.
but typically more like 12 hours. And between that and Shakespeare, someone writing for the ages, there's this middle ground of different sort of life expectancies that are both reasonable and appropriate to a certain kind of piece of work. And a lot of political books, and books of the sort that I've written, no one writes them thinking they're going to be read in 10 years, because it's very much about the moment. Some years ago when Barack Obama was still president and I was getting a little disenchanted with the conservative media world, I threatened to write a book called Democrats Suck, blank Obama in the Ear, and make it like one of, parody of one of these Fox News books with a lady in a little black dress on the cover with kind of big hair and do it like that. Those books can make a lot of money and they can be influential. They can make a real contribution. I'm not sneering at them necessarily. There's some important books like that are not going to be read in 5 years, but they are important for the moment. Do you think electronic books are maybe sort of, from just an economic point of view, encouraging a kind of a way of serving a time horizon of a book that would be hard to serve with hard copy print or even paperbacks or things like that?
I think your question is a little off base, and here's why.
Okay.
All books published today by publishers are published in multiple formats. So we don't just publish a book digitally. There's always a print edition.
Always?
Yeah. Any commercial publisher will have. Now, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to print the book. But they can make it available on a print-on-demand basis. So if you go to Amazon, like I publish a lot of books this way in the company that I work with today, we publish a lot of books on a POD basis. The consumer doesn't know the difference. You go to Amazon the web page, and there's the book. It's the cover, and you can choose whether to have a printed copy or a digital copy. So it's not an either-or situation, and this is a relatively new development, by the way. The POD revolution is a fairly recent vintage. There was a time when, as when any new communication technology is introduced, going back to Gutenberg, there's always a wave of kind of utopian, like this is going to completely change everything, and often it does, but it doesn't mean that what came before is gone. People thought that about radio, about television, about the internet, and the e-book. And what generally happens in every case, and it'll happen with AI as well, is after an initial wave of fear and anxiety, enthusiasm followed by fear and loathing, the new technology finds its place in the ecosystem. It serves a certain segment of the market. When ebooks were introduced, publishers thought this will destroy our hardcover business. But what happened? And the answer to that was, but it'll create a new market, and both were true. There is a certain readership that prefers to read books digitally. And then there are people who prefer to own the physical book. And it's very much dependent on the category of book. For example, children's books do not sell in digital form. Nobody wants to read to their kid a digital book. They want the physical book that you can sit with your child and turn the pages and watch their face. And, it's an experience. You have kids, you know this. So children's publishing isn't threatened by digital publishing. At the same time, if you look at patterns which have definitely emerged in the distribution of, let's say you publish a particular book, and you want to know how many people bought the physical book versus the digital book, the proportions are fairly consistent. If it's a work of fiction, you're going to sell a number of ebooks about generally equivalent to 80 or 90% of the physical sale. If you publish a nonfiction book, that percent drops to about 20%. So what that means is that people prefer to read nonfiction in hard copy, but the people who read novels digitally are not stealing from the print version, and they're not paying substantially less either. By the way, just from our point of view, where it's an add-on, it's an extra audience. So the only thing that you could say about ebooks, I would say that they did cannibalize the paperback market for a lot of these books, because the digital copy is available now. It's cheaper than the hardcover. Many people used to wait for the paperback, right? Right. But now they don't have to. They can buy the ebook. I hope that it's complex.
If you were starting over today, would you still go into book publishing? Would you do something else?
Well,
I don't see you as a TikTok dance kind of guy.
no, I mean, if I knew today, if I knew then what I know now, I would go into book publishing, because I still would, because it's a very exciting time to be in book publishing. You have direct access to the consumer. There's the tools are available to produce and publish books very cheaply. And you have, if you're a person who cares about books, the greatest thing, particularly about, because I am an independent publisher now. Why am I doing this? I could have stayed in big publishing. The reason I left is that my job 98% of my job consisted in saying no to people whose books I would otherwise have published, because they didn't reach a certain level of commercial potential. Now I can say yes to everybody. Anybody I want to publish, I can. The costs are very low. And we have less resources to work with. We don't, the big houses, as I said, they invest a lot of money in these books, and they have the budget to do that. But by the same token, if they don't earn back that money, they're in trouble. So I'm publishing, 30 books a year as opposed to 10. And I have a lot more latitude in terms of what I can publish. I can throw crap at the wall, see if it sticks,
Well, tell me about your current venture and what you're doing, who you're publishing, and
So I went into business with I was my last big publishing job. I started out at Simon and Schuster. I worked then at Random House, Doubleday Random House. I worked at HarperCollins. I worked at St. Martin's Press, and at all these places I published conservative books as well as general interest books. But I became increasingly disheartened by the bureaucratic context in which I was operating, which is really just saps the joy of life. It just destroys your joy in what you do. And I will say, the one thing I will say is that, because people ask me, I'm 68 years old, do you plan to retire? And the answer is no, because I still have this feeling, this kind of childlike expectation. Every time I get a manuscript or a proposal, I say to myself, this could be what's in here. This could be the most fantastic thing. And it's like getting a present on Christmas morning. And if I ever stop feeling that, I'll quit. But I haven't, and I don't expect to. The way I got into my current position is as an independent publisher is that for many years, I have publishing friends that I have known, my whole life. And one of those friends went out on his own about 15 years ago and started his own company based in Nashville. It's called Post Hill. And Post Hill has become a very lively, diverse publishing company. It does about 220 books a year. And the owner and publisher is a fellow conservative who worked at Simon & Schuster and Random House. And we used to get together for a drink a couple times a year, and he would always tell me how much fun he was having, doing whatever the hell he wanted. And it started to sound better and better to me. And so finally I said, hey, what about it? And so I went into business with him, and we publish I published 2 lines of books. One, I sort of took over an existing imprint of conservative titles, and we publish a wide range of conservative authors, many of whom are known to you. We publish Kash Patel, Dan Bongino, people who are currently in the administration. I published Julie Kelly's book on January 6th, which I wanted to call "What Insurrection," but we ended up calling it January 6th. And many other books, that by authors that I've published over the years, that I've brought in, and new people that we've discovered, young people. It's a very open kind of thing. And then at a certain point, I started getting a lot of submissions from Jewish authors. And I've always published Jewish books. I published some significant Jewish books in my past, but I never published Jewish books, although being Jewish, I never published Jewish books as a program, but as kind of a sideline. But I started getting enough material, and what you say to yourself as an editor is, it's like, oh, the salmon are running. Get out your net. Let's see. We need a container for all this. But create an imprint. Why not? That's what imprints are for. They bring more focus and attention to the books within the series rather than just throwing them out ad hoc. So we created a Jewish imprint, and that's thriving. I didn't realize what was about to happen in Jewish life, because this was 3 years ago when we started this. But it has emerged as a very important initiative, because Jews are being, I don't know whether this may be news to your listeners, but Jews are being purged out of publishing along with in other institutional settings. And it's a cause for deep alarm, especially, as you pointed out, given the outsized role of Jews in bringing American publishing out of the 19th century and turning it into a global powerhouse. But that's not just to do with Jews, it's also to do with the wokeism that's rampant in publishing today. And these young kids who they have hired out of the liberal arts colleges, who used to be, very serious, earnest young people who had read, Flaubert and, were like had good taste. They used to sit respectfully and, around the outside of the room while the editors, the grown-ups, discussed what they were going to publish. And now they assert themselves very boldly. They say, "Oh no, this is racist," and everybody's intimidated by them, and they're going to destroy publishing because they don't know what the hell they're doing. They're being given too much authority to make publishing decisions, and they have, you as a publisher, it's not really an either or. There are two ways to be a publisher. One is to lead the market. The other is to follow the market. Frankly, you want to do both. You want to mix. So there's leading the market means that you're following your own taste and judgment, and you're saying, this is a book that people should like, people should read. The young people coming out of liberal arts colleges today are activists, like the young journalists being produced at Columbia and other J schools, and they're only interested in what they think you should read. They have contempt for you, frankly, and your taste, which they think is, racist and, bad in all kinds of ways. And they've been given big checkbooks, and they're spending huge sums of money on books that they think you should read. And of course, it's going to turn out that you're not going to read them, and that those books will fail. And hopefully, the publishing industry will come to its senses in time to correct course. But I have my doubts about that.
Yeah, as a famous economist said, the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent.
Well said.
Yeah.
Yes.
Keynes, that was. I could talk to you about this all day, but I know you've got books to publish and things. I'll ask you a question in closing, although feel free to talk about anything you want to that I haven't asked you about. But don't ask me if I have a favorite kid, but I will ask you, do you have a favorite book that you've published? And if the answer is the one that made me the most money, that's fine too, which I'd be curious about. But of all the books you've published, which one is the one you look back on and go, I'm really glad I did that one?
I love that question. I have been asked that question before, and the answer to the answer is not the one that made me the most money. That one was Sarah Palin's memoir, Going Rogue, which sold 2.5 million copies, and is by far the most successful book that I ever published. thereby certainly hangs a tale. I would say for another time. Um, but the favorite book that I've published. So I will say this: it's an obscure book that I'm sure you have not heard of, but it came into it came in over the transom and under a title that I knew would work. It was called Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean,
You're right. I haven't heard of that one.
and it was a great book. And here's why I loved it, because the author was an eccentric guy, Jewish guy from Queens named Ed Kritzler. He came into my office with his shirt open, a high medallion, a big honking Jewish schnoz, and Queens guy, you know. And he told me the following story. He said, some years ago, I moved to Jamaica to work for the Jamaican Film Board and to give permission to people to make movies there. And I started running into people who had funny compound names like Cohen Enriquez. And I said, well, where'd you get that name? And the answer was, oh, well, we've been here since 1492. And then that's where he learned that there had been an exodus of Jews from Spain and Portugal to the New World, and a lot of them fetched up in places like Jamaica and in Brazil and in Mexico. And they went into business as pirates preying on the Spanish treasure fleet. And they would sail out, they would rob one of these ships, they'd bring the booty back to, Jamaica and sell the goods on the wharf. And it turns out that a lot of these famous pirates that people, have heard of, like Jean Lafitte, were Jews, and they were hidden Jews, and they would, as they were, hiding from the Inquisition. And it was a virtually unknown chapter of Jewish history. And Ed, who had, I guess, nothing better to do, spent 20 years in the royal archives of Mexico, Spain, Portugal, Amsterdam, looking up the records of these people and doing real historical research, the kind that you really have to be dedicated to doing, to make discoveries that other people have not made. Most books are, basically, if they're not original, fiction or works of opinion, are, historical books. They're kind of recycled material from other books, which include a lot of the errors that they're incorporated in the source material. I had a lot of respect for Ed, and he was a terrible writer, so I had to rewrite the book, but everybody loved it from the title. It was just, as soon as it came in and I shared it with my colleagues, everybody laughed, because that was when the Johnny Depp movie was out, and the Pirates of the Caribbean, and everybody said, oh yeah, this will work. And it did. It worked like a charm. And the author died, sadly, a few years later, but I felt, as a publisher, having been able to give this guy his shot as a writer and publish the one book that he was ever going to write, and have it be a lasting success, really fulfilled every impulse that I have that motivates me as a publisher. So that's my answer to your question.
While you were telling that story, I was thinking that this would be a great Mel Brooks movie, Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, which also reminded me of something that
You're right.
did an interview a couple of months ago. He's quite old, but he's still very, very sharp and with it. And someone was asking him about Blazing Saddles, and they said, you couldn't make that movie now, and he said you couldn't make it then. And I think there's something to that. You must hear that from time to time about some of the stuff you've published, that you couldn't publish the Bell Curve now. You couldn't publish it then, really, either.
Hell yeah, that's absolutely true. There's no way that, for a number of reasons, not just ideological, but also just based on the size of the book, its character as a work of social science. I mean, a serious scientific book, or an academic book, with a massive length and a high price. And people would have the business people would have said, this will never work, and they might be. But to go back to your question about controversy, we didn't conclude that part of our discussion. All this digitization and the resulting polarization, it has sort of made debate both shallow and polarized. And what I see, what I observe as a publisher, is that you can't start arguments about books anymore. You can publish all the supposedly controversial books you want. No one is going to take the bait. There has to be, partly like there has to be an organized intellectual culture in order to have a serious debate about a book, and we don't have that anymore. There's the intellectual culture has been hollowed out. The magazines. This is the death of the magazine. This is really what it comes down to. The Atlantic Monthly, is a shell. The New Republic is a shell. The conservative magazines, are clickbait. There's just very little out there that where there used to be these intense forums of editorial groups where they would really argue. I knew guys at the New Republic. I was a friend of Marty Parrott's and Andrew Sullivan. Andrew was my partner in publishing the Bell Curve. He excerpted the book. There was a staff revolt at the New Republic. They all attacked it. And Andrew nearly got fired. I mean, that was exciting, because people cared. They cared intensely, and they were educated enough and had enough, intellectual integrity to feel that, not my magazine, like that kind of thing. And NR, when I worked there, had that quality too. I worked at NR for about a year and a half when Bill Buckley was still alive. He was emeritus, but his spirit prevailed, and there was a serious place. And I guess that kind of brings me back to the great decline since my father's day. The people that I knew, his friends, the people that I met around him, were serious people, and I think that standard of seriousness has declined and disappeared. We just don't have people who take themselves, and their audience and their readers seriously at a certain level. And it's a reflection of a lot of changes in the culture, and not just in media. So, what that means for publishers is it makes it harder. It makes it harder to do our work in a way that we feel is making a difference, elevating the discourse, the conversation in America today, and I despair of that. I don't feel good about it, but it is it is what I do. It's my vocation, and I wouldn't choose another one.
Adam Bellow, thank you for being so generous with your time. I look forward to maybe continuing this conversation some other time. I can tell you that you don't need to despair about staff revolts at magazines. I'll tell you all about one of these days. This Atlantic Monthly place you mentioned, which still exists from what I hear, although I don't look at it that often anymore. Adam Bellow, thanks so much, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great talking to you.
Bye bye.
Be well. Bye.